Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And it appears, as we continue to watch this conflict, that at least on the Ukrainian side of the equation, it does appear that certain elements of the Ukrainian sphere of influence, the Ukrainian content provider community, even obviously the mainstream media here in the United States, believes that some sort of very large Ukrainian counteroffensive is being prepared. Now, we have seen evidence that would indicate that the Ukrainians are bringing up more and more equipment to the front lines, especially in the area south of Zaparation. We have seen armored vehicle transport trucks moving Bradley armored fighting vehicles. We have seen strikers. We have seen other systems being moved towards the front. And it does look like the Ukrainians are preparing for something on the surface. Now, this could be a very large deception operation designed to draw Russian forces away from Russian plans, Russian future-facing offensive operations. But for today, I wanted to look at a hypothetical, which could very well turn into a very much real Ukrainian offensive operation in the south towards Zaparation. Because right now, that at least appears where it's going to be. If, for instance, I were the warfighter, the battlefield commander, would I conduct an operation in the south? Probably not. I'd be looking for something a bit more aggressive. Maybe I'll talk about that here in a second. But again, you have an accumulation of essentially two Ukrainian corps, one on the eastern bank, one on the western bank of the Dnieper River, that in all likelihood could be transported to the eastern bank and be utilized in this offensive operation against Russian forces. Now, this could be a multi-prong operation. It could be an operation designed to test Russian capabilities to see if the Russian front will start to crumble. And in all likelihood, if the operation is to take place in the south, I believe we will first see a probing operation just south of Zaparation, a very large-scale reconnaissance in force, followed by a multi-brigade operation in the Zaparation steppe area south of Zaparation. In all likelihood, the operation would take place designed to press south of Orikhiv, seize control of Tokmak, and then eventually press on towards Melitopol. Now, the problem with this is I believe that if the Russian lines were to start to crumble, now please understand, this is hypothetical. Hypothetically, if Russian lines were start to fall apart and crumble, and the Russians were possibly facing Ukrainian forces rolling into Melitopol or on the outskirts of it. And again, you have a major intersection here, major roadways that run west, east, north, and south. This would be detrimental to continued Russian operations in the land bridge area in Zaporizhia Oblast. Now, if that were to take place, if we were to see the Russian military start to fall apart, then you would also see another operation, quite possibly by the Ukrainians, due west of Volhodar, along this major route towards Mariupol. Now, if that were to happen, if we were really starting to see the Russian forces completely losing initiative, being destroyed, then in all likelihood we would see the Russians use tactical nuclear weapons. I don't believe the Russians will lose Melitopol or Mariupol without them using tactical nuclear weapons. Meaning, if the Russians believe that they are going to lose Melitopol, Mariupol, I do believe the Russians will give the release of tactical nuclear weapons. Now, is that going to happen? That's a stretch, but again, a possibility. This is how you get into the sphere of nuclear escalation. And there are a multitude of reasons why the Russians would use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukrainian forces. Now, on the flip side of this, this could be a trap that is being set by Russian forces for Ukrainian forces. These areas, running from Zaparation all the way to Donetsk, very flat, very open terrain. And it's going to be incredibly difficult for Ukrainian forces to move in these columns south. Because again, if we're talking about an offensive operation that's going to occur late April, which is getting close, the terrain is still muddy. It is not dry yet in Ukraine. That doesn't take place until later. Still going to be muddy, especially if you are moving multiple brigade sets. These roads degrade very quickly. And if you've ever had the opportunity of being in armored vehicles, especially tracked armored vehicles, over open terrain that is somewhat muddy, it just gets worse and worse. The ruts get deeper and deeper and deeper, and it becomes very difficult to maneuver. Again, especially because of the high water table here in Ukraine. So the Ukrainians could be facing the same sorts of challenges that the Russians faced in their move towards Kiev and other areas when the invasion started. But let's go over to the other map here along Zaparation. This will give you an idea of the defensive fortifications that the Russians have set up. You're looking at a multitude, a two-layer defense network that runs from the Dnieper River east. And you have multiple battalion tactical groups, regimental size formations that are defending these areas. So this is going to be a very difficult and will probably be the largest operation if what we're hearing from the Ukrainian side proves true. Again, possibility this is a deception operation designed to draw Russian forces from other areas. We just don't know yet. But there is reason to believe that the Ukrainians could be preparing for something. Now, is this a 3-brigade operation or is it a 20-brigade operation? We don't know yet. The Ukrainians, though, right now are making it appear to look like quite possibly a very large operation into that 10 to 20 brigade area. And I believe initially that the Ukrainians are going to look at the M18 highway just east of the Dnieper River. And they're also going to look at the area just north of Tokmak. So I think initially you'll have a multi-pronged, multi-brigade operation, one heading towards Tokmak, the other moving down the M18, again with supporting assets such as HIMARS, M109s, All these weapon systems that have been delivered to the Ukrainians being used in this area. But again, this is very flat terrain. And it is not as wooded, it is not as much foliage as what we see further east in the forested areas of the Donbass. Or some of the forested areas, I should say. So again, very interesting what we're seeing right now, and it's hard to say, it's difficult to say if this is really what is going to happen. Again, possibility of deception operation, possibility that the Ukrainians could be looking elsewhere. And here is the map of Bakmut. The Bakmut butcher shop, as I'm calling it. Heavy fighting continues north and on the eastern outskirts of the city. Right now, the Russians appear to be focusing quite a bit of effort on the north side and have penetrated, again, across the railway system that splits the city in two. And the Russians, again, are working due east, due north, and due south as well, with still a very large component of the Ukrainian military. Well, I don't want to say a very large component of the Ukrainian military. There are multiple brigades operating in and around Bakmut, as I've talked about before, that are at risk of being cut off. So we'll have to continue to watch that and see what happens there. But the Russians are continuing to press its attack. They are continuing to fix Ukrainian positions and then use a lot of artillery to degrade and destroy those Ukrainian units. And we'll go back to the finally the deep state map. I'm sorry, we're going to go, yes. So again, not a lot has changed. I can go back a week and you can kind of see again. Very little movement. This is right now a fixed positional war with lots of artillery, lots of reconnaissance drones, and lots of artillery strikes and the use of air power by Russian forces against Ukrainian forces. And obviously there's a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian general staff to make something happen. A lot of treasure, a lot of resources have been handed over to the Ukrainian forces. And now there is an expectation to use some of those resources against the Russian military. And again, in all probability, we're looking at something taking place down here to the south. But let's get a little creative. Let's get a little hypothetical. If you were the Ukrainians, what would be the easiest way to get the Russians to the table? If you really have this offensive capacity, this multi-brigade capacity with some of these advanced weapon systems, they don't have the M1 Abrams tanks. They have a few. They have a few Challengers. They have a few Leopard 2s. And they have several dozen Bradleys and Strykers. What if the Ukrainians made a move towards Belgorod? I'm just saying, what if? What would the Russians do? Is there significant Russian forces within the vicinity of Belgorod to prevent a successful Ukrainian operation coming out of Kharkov? The Ukrainians would have the ability to hide the massing of forces in Kharkov, potato, and then launch such an operation towards Belgorod. What if, just what if, the Ukrainians were threatening to encircle Belgorod and had moved into the city proper? I'm just asking a question. What would the Russians do? Would they authorize the release of tactical nuclear weapons? Probably. But I'm asking you, the viewer, what do you think would happen? I've talked about before the possibility of the Ukrainians making a move towards Belarus. And I think at this point, the more opportunistic, most aggressive target for the Ukrainians to really shake things up, again, would be an operations toward Belgorod. Would it be successful? Or would it be a disaster? Would the United States support a multi-brigade Ukrainian move towards Belgorod, inside of Russia proper? Difficult to say at this point. But again, if the Ukrainians really wanted to shake things up and cause issue for the Russians, I would envision that's the sort of operations the Ukrainians would look to do. And look, this is a war. This is not a special military operation. This is not this or that. This is a war. Now, it is possible that behind the scenes, agreements have been made to restrict the conflict. But ultimately, if you feel you are in a position as a military force to maneuver and defeat the enemy, then you have to ignore the political ramifications and you have to execute. So again, if it's good for the Russians to move towards Kiev, then it would be okay for the Ukrainians to move towards Belgorod, in my book. But again, I do believe at that point, if Belgorod was threatened, the Russians would seek nuclear release. And then where are we at? So difficult call. Difficult at that point to say what would happen if they would release nukes. Would they have to release tactical nuclear weapons on actual Russian territory or Ukrainian territory? Or is this just a big work of fiction? Do the Ukrainians not have the capability to launch said operations? Again, as I've talked about before, big deception operation. Make the enemy believe you are much more powerful than you actually are, which then inherently prevents the enemy, meaning Russia, from launching their offensive operations against you. And this is the dynamic of this conflict we're watching. So that's where we're at for today. We are watching things very, very closely, given what is coming out of the Ukrainian side. But again, I do envision the Russians as well, again, late June, July, August. Watch those dates. That's all I have for today. Have a good day.